everyone. My name is Allie Katz. I'm the program coordinator at Kelly Writers House. Welcome to this amazing live stream event with editors from the Nib, which, if you're familiar, is a totally awesome nonfiction and journalism and memoir and satire comics journalism site. I said journalism twice. Sorry, everyone. Program coordinator. This event is part of the Applebaum Publishers and Editors series. I just want to take a second to thank Erwin and Lucy Applebaum for their support. It's really great opportunity to talk about the behind the scenes work of putting journalism and books out into the world. So thank you for that. I am going to just intro our guests for a second. So start there. Matt Bors, who's the founder of the Nib, is a cartoonist and editor. He founded the Nib in 2013. His work has appeared in The Nation, The Guardian, Daily Kos, and many other outlets. He was a two-time 2012 Pulitzer Prize Finalist for his political cartoons, which were recently collected in the book We Should Improve Society Somewhat. And you've maybe seen that comic floating around. WHIT TAYLOR. WHIT TAYLOR is a cartoonist, writer, and educator from New Jersey. She's a contributing editor to the Nib. MATTIE LUBCHANSKY is the associate editor of the Nib and cartoonist and illustrator living in Queens. Their work has appeared in New York Magazine, Vice, Eater, Mad Magazine, Gothamist, The Toast, The Hairpin, Brooklyn Magazine, and their long-running webcomic, Please Listen to Me. They are also the co-author of Dad Magazine. Larry Harris is a cartoonist, journalist, and features editor at the Nib. Her cartoons have been published online and in print by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, Mean Gin, Q Point, Reform, Symbolia, Narrative.ly, Paddle Creek, Grapple Annual in 7 Days, and her Nib comic series Reported Missing was shortlisted for the 2018 Center for Cartoon Studies and Slate Book Review Cartoonist Studio Prize and won gold at the 2018 Ledger Awards in Australia. So really, we have some of the best cartoonists working in nonfiction cartooning and satire cartooning right here. Totally amazing crew, and I'm incredibly excited as a fan. That's why I'm using such incredibly big hyper language. Also, it's I haven't talked to a lot of people recently, so my vocabulary is shrinking. So apologies for that level of enthusiasm. So hi everyone, welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having us.
Hey.
Started with just a slideshow. Matt's going to talk a little bit about the Nib and where it came from, and then each cartoonist will take an opportunity to talk a little bit about their work too. So bear with us as we switch into that mode. So this takes a second.
You want me to give a little background on the Nib right now?
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having us, first of all. If you're not familiar with the Nib, you already heard the basics, which is that we run political cartoons, nonfiction, memoir. Started in 2013 at Medium, and then, we've gone through a couple publishers. We were with Medium for a while, and then they dropped us. Then we were with First Lift Media, and over the years, we sort of changed what we're doing a little bit. We always publish online. We have a daily newsletter with daily political cartoons, and then in I don't even know what year it was now. 2018, we started the magazine. So that was started out as a quarterly magazine. It's 3 times a year now, and we're completely independent as of a year and a half ago, in 2019. And we have our newest issue is the pandemic issue, featuring this great art from Eleanor Davis that you're looking at. And we publish books sometimes too. We have a book called Greetings from the Wasteland, which is a collection of, we call it the Nib's best political cartoons from the worst era. So those are the basics. And those are our beautiful magazine covers. So I'm going to just read through a comic. I think we're all going to show a few of our comics. This is just one that I ran recently, right at the end of 2020. and features some characters I use pretty regularly. So this year was so bad. I look at it differently. This year taught us so much. We know how to stockpile PPE and food for ever more gnarly pandemics and societal breakdown. Our nervous systems are trained to deal with coming 5G suicide bombers and anti-vax gangs. And we've acclimated to constant mass death, which is going to be a crucial skill in the water wars. Oh, and never pull your dick out on a Zoom call or a panel with Kelly's Writer's House. With the Warlord Cannibals we work for. Yeah, they absolutely will not tolerate it. So that's my comic. I mostly do just political cartoons like this, and largely just draw wasteland apocalyptic stuff anymore.
Hello, I'm Larry. I am a cartoonist and journalist. I have a background in journalism, and so a lot of my comics are focusing on using journalism as a basis for making comics. So this comic was a nib piece in 2017, reported missing. It was the one that I got a lot of awards for because it's real long and involved trying to figure out what it's like to have your mum convicted of murdering your dad. That's basically the gist of it. And it's really long. It was the longest thing I've ever made. I use like watercolor and stuff like that medium to make my comics a lot of the time. Although I did learn how to use an iPad to draw with in 2020. That was a year of learning lots of things, wasn't it? Hoarding PPE, using Procreate, which is an app from where I'm from, Tasmania. So I felt really patriotic for, learning how to use Procreate. And I have a toddler, and now apparently I make mum comics about having a toddler. And this was one I did last year when we first started and everyone was talking about sourdough. Those times. And this is a comic I did in collaboration with Julia Bernhard, who's a cartoonist based in Germany, about scams for your vagina. All the different things you can spend money on that are a total waste. Your vagina is perfect as it is, just so you know, everyone listening.
Sorry, I was muted. Hi, I'm Matt Lubchansky, and I, like Mr. Boers, I do a lot of the weekly political comics on the site. Here's one that I did, I don't know, I think this ran like a month or two ago when we were first starting to trickle in stuff with the vaccine. It was probably last year, sometime in 2021. What a year. Thank goodness we've got a vaccine. Things will be normal in just a few scant weeks. Good news, friend. You can stop screaming about how masks are tyranny now. We've got a vaccine. Oh, so the government is denying my righteous death on the altar of my glorious God King Trump, who, by the way, is still president, despite him leaving office months ago. Vaccines are tyranny. Hey, things are basically back to normal already. So it's a lot of that kind of work about how things are bad and have always been bad and will always be bad. And then the next slide, there was some work of mine from our recent collection, Be Gay Do Comics, which is all queer comics. And here's an original piece I did for the book about as a trans non-binary person trying to find clothing and talking about fashion and androgyny and like what it means to present as an androgynous person, like the societal definition versus what an individual person can actually do. I'm trying to do more and more, I guess, more serious meditative work like that in the spaces that we can.
Okay, there we go. Hi, everyone. So this is a comic called America Isn't Ready for a Pandemic that I made it's published in January of 2018, which might have been a little bit before pandemics were in people's mind, but it was certainly on my mind. So I mentioned in my bio that I'm a public health educator. I have a master's in public health and with a focus on health education. So like for me, I like doing a lot of comics around health issues, some of them that I think can be a little technical, and I like to kind of break it down and explore it in comics format. So I'd been worrying about pandemic, and especially a pandemic under the Trump administration. And so that was why I proposed this story back in 2018, and it's getting some more reads now for obvious reasons. So yeah. And yes, that is true, I would say. So that's just a quote from like a famous epidemiologist who was like, if we have a pandemic, it's going to uproot everything, like the economy, yada, 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 like our lifestyles. And so far it's been both what I expected and way worse. So yeah, there's that. This is a comic I did last year, Black Mothers Face for Our Worst Health Outcomes. How do we fix it? So a lot of my work for the NIB has also been on like race and culture and like identity. I would say like my comics kind of take the form of a comics essay where it's a combination of like research and also like personal experiences woven in. So this one was about how Black mothers in the US face worse health outcomes. And I wrote this while I was pregnant. My son's now almost 10 months. So, but yeah, so this just started with the whole issue with Serena Williams and how she had like really bad health like issues in the hospital, even though she was like rich and famous, and how race can be a factor in healthcare bias. There's me last year. It was like a month before the pandemic, so I had no clue that like I would directly become a mom at the same time as the pandemic started, which has been interesting. So yeah. And then sometimes I work with other people. This is a comic I wrote that Shannon Wright drew. I was actually literally just like talking to Shannon right before this. And this is about Shirley Chisholm and her, just like her really interesting story. And yeah, I like sometimes I really enjoy just writing it and teaming up with someone else. So I like to do historical comics as well, and this is just an example of that.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing your comics there. They're all so cool and so different. Which is one of the things that I think is really compelling about the NIB is that a lot of times comics get sort of pigeonholed into one thing, like it's as a genre instead of as a form, and it's really easy for people to get hung up on like, oh, it's comics, so it's all the same, when obviously like even within like a genre of comics, there's a lot of dynamic work to be done. I want to start a little bit with talking about how the NIB happened, what the sort of vision initially was, and move a little bit toward talking about how it's sustainable and how your lives are sustainable. So Matt, can you tell me a little bit about how the NIB got started?
Yeah, it was, you know, I've been really into just sort of publications as a thing for a long time, and had the idea of starting a comics publication probably a few years before I was able to. And when Medium was first starting up, they were like commissioning a lot of these sort of little publications that they were running on their publishing platform and funding them. So I just pitched them on doing the NIB, you know, pretty much as it is today, as this combination of political cartoons and nonfiction journalistic comics. So, I mean, the idea is sort of these two genres, I guess you could say, you know, one being very old editorial cartooning, famously kind of dying. There weren't a lot of outlets in the internet age that were really supporting a ton of this work. I was sort of part of the last, feels like the last generation of people who sort of did it in print for alt weeklies. And that's the style that we kind of, most of the cartoonists work in, there's not a lot of like labeled donkeys and elephants and stuff. That work's still being done and people hanging on to jobs at daily newspapers. But for the most part, it's just not the approach that I think most people take if they're like, if they're getting into political cartooning anymore. So it was, creating an outlet for that, kind of making a hub for this type of work to be supported. And then this newer genre of nonfiction comics and journalistic comics, 10 years ago, the Nib's been around for 7 years, but like 10 years ago, there wasn't really that much work in this field. I mean, there were people like Sarah Glidden was starting to publish stuff, obviously Joe Sacco, but there was just a lot of us that were interested in this kind of stuff, and sort of took off in the last 10 years. With now, there's just a ton of practitioners, a ton of nonfiction graphic novels being released, and just being an outlet to sort of publish and promote that kind of work.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things is, and I got my career start at an alt weekly in editorial and writing, and it really was hard to see. I grew up in Chicago. I grew up with the Reader, which used to have like 10 comics in it, just like really just a gigantic comic section with the classifieds. And now neither of those things really exist. Maybe there's a comic in an alt weekly and it's syndicated, and it's like maybe Linda Berry is still getting published some places, but that market really has shrunk. So, but I also think it's interesting how nonfiction as journalism comics weren't really a thing like 10 years ago, with a handful of exceptions. But memoir comics were this first set of comics to be taken like seriously, with like a capital G, capital N graphic novel weight. So it's cool to see how those things are sort of coming together, and then splintering apart again, I guess, in to see them like, to see it be like, to have a reported piece, or to have something that really illuminates things for somebody graphically, I think is really awesome. I think it also leads to a really interesting question of how, because it's sort of new, political cartooning obviously is very old, but this kind of cartooning is very new. How did each of you get your start with it? And I want to start with Illyri. Do you want to talk about how you started with nonfiction comics?
Sure. So my background is in journalism, like I said before, and 8 million years ago in another universe, I read Joe Sacco's The Fixer, and I'd done cartoons for like my university newspaper and all, and that sort of thing. And then when I read The Fixer, I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. But I really didn't have any idea how, at that point in time, I had worked in online journalism for a number of years, and I was a cross-media reporter in radio. So I did a lot of stuff that was crossing journalism with the digital world. I actually taught digital media at a university before any of this stuff. And then I decided to go to the Center for Cartoon Studies in Vermont to learn how to do comics professionally, because I was like, if I'm going to be able to change careers and making comics my career as a journalist, then I need some training. So I went to CCS, and actually while I was at CCS, I went to TCAF, which is where I met Matt Bors, who was spruiking some of his own books at that show. Spruiking is an Australian word. Promoting his work at his book, Life Begins at Incorporation. He was promoting that book. And at the time, I was like really interested in how like Matt had started doing stuff for Cartoon Movement, like comics journalism pieces for Cartoon Movement that was shorter, like not Joe Sacco book length comics, but like shorter comics. And there are a few places that had started publishing like these shorter like online web comics that were comics journalism pieces, and using like the traditional tools of a journalist as a basis for the comics. And so I was really interested in that, and I started working for Matt basically as soon as I graduated. That's all I've really done since then, and it's been really interesting because we've taught a lot of people how to make comics journalism pieces just through virtue of people pitching us the first idea they've ever had for a piece that is like a non-fiction of this particular type, like something specifically designed for the web. It's not particularly long, like usually like we have like 40 panels is like the maximum number of panels we let cartoons be, because we discovered early on in the medium days that if a cartoon was longer than 40 panels, it was really hard to keep people's attention on a website for that long. Like people will sit down to read a book, but they won't sit down on their computer to read like a longer piece in that way. So that's why my piece that we had on the slide, Reported Missing, was actually broken up into a bunch of different chapters so that it wasn't too long, and you could just read it in sections like that. But yeah, it's been kind of an incredible journey. Like I feel like we've been kind of an integral part of like the comics journalism, nonfiction comic stuff online, just by default of starting to publish at that particular moment. Yeah, that would be what I say.
Yeah, I think that I think it's pretty safe to say that the nib described what this kind of comic could be. I think that's like a sort of you made a self-defining category, which is awesome. And Whit, how did you get involved in comics journalism, nonfiction comics, coming from a public health background?
Sure. Well, I think I'd always been interested in nonfiction comics, even if I didn't like have a name specifically for it. I remember I used to like read this series. It was called the Introducing series, and it was like these little books where they'd like introduce like Eastern philosophy or like some quantum physics, whatever, and there'd be like little illustrations, and that was like, oh, that's really cool. I didn't really think of it as comics, but it was something I was like, I would want to do that. And even just like in school, like when I'd study for exams, I would draw stuff like to help me understand things. Like I'd make comics as study guides and stuff like that. So when I went to grad school, and I was also like had a background in like teaching high school briefly, and so I was really interested in like how do you communicate information clearly and like keep someone's attention essentially. So I guess like the opportunity with the nib was like the first time I really did a nonfiction comic, and I met Larry at MICE, the Massachusetts Independent Comics Expo, like way back, I don't know, like 2011, 2012, 2010, something like that. And we just like known each other through shows and whatnot. And then I did my first comic for the nib, I think it was 2015 or something like that, and then continued to do them. I didn't become an contributing editor till last year, when Matt had reached out about doing starting to do some pieces. So yeah.
Wait, do you remember what your first piece was? I don't remember off the top of my head.
I think it was like a short 4-panel thing about Urban Outfitters. Like I think that was the first one. Like I usually forget about it, but then I remember like the next one was about the myth of the strong Black woman. That was in the winter.
It's a good comic, that one.
Yeah, that was a good one to work on. So yeah.
Cool. Sorry. And Matt, your background is even sort of farther from the public explaining of journalism and health education. You were an engineer, right, before switching to cartooning?
Yeah, well, it's actually funny. The day that I got hired as the NIBS editorial assistant, it was at the time in like 2013 or 2014. The night that I got the job offer, I had been fired that afternoon for my last regular job I've ever had, which was working as an assistant for a glass blower, which I was doing for a while after I left engineering. But I was working as a cartoonist like at night and on the weekends, going to conventions and spruiking my own work, stuff like that. But was I was doing that for a long time, and then I had a comic that like got around on Twitter some, and then Matt emailed me, asked me if I wanted to run it on the nib as a reprint, which was at the time incredible for me. It was the first time I'd gotten paid for just a comic. I'd gotten paid for some illustrations before, but never just like, here's a comic that you wrote and drew and I'm being paid for it. And then I did my first original work for the nib, and then just over time I was doing more and more work, and then eventually it was just got brought over to the editorial side.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And Matt Fours, how did you go about building this team? I think we've got a little pieces of that from everybody, but like,
well,
you're like,
the nib benefited early on from this sort of flood of money into internet companies, I guess, billionaire-backed media companies that started around, probably 2012, 2013, I think. So that first one was Medium. And, I knew that they didn't have a particular interest in comics. I mean, beyond liking the idea for the publication, but they were, really interested in traffic and building readerships and anything that could build its own sort of readership. They were really into with testing out these publications. And one of the reasons that they greenlit the nib was that I kind of said that I could get a lot of people by bringing all these popular cartoonists in. And so the reason why it grew, I guess, staff-wise especially, is just that, Medium sort of threw a lot of money into it. And I really wanted it to be a daily publication. And it was just pretty clear that, we were publishing like a fire hose of comics, and it's a lot of work. I mean, you're putting together newsletters, social media, editing the comics themselves. The long form comics in particular take a ton of time. And we still run one a week, but we used to run like 3 a week. It's at one point, it's just an insane pace. So it was like, Larry was helping out with editing just a few months into the nib launching. And then, I forget the exact dates, but Matt came on pretty shortly after. And then, they weren't full-time, but then I eventually got them full-time work. And then there was more work. So then there was people like Andy Warner doing some stuff, Sarah Merck. And it's fluctuated throughout time because, of course, we all got laid off twice from these companies. But that's basically how it grew.
Yeah, I think definitely the media landscape is an unsafe and tenuous place to begin with. And when you're trying to do something new, I think it's probably even more precarious. But you've built a real community around the comics that come from the nib and the contributors from the nib. And I want to talk just for a second, and then for anyone watching this, you can put a question into the YouTube chat, and we have a team of Writers House staffers who will send the questions this way for any of the panelists, so we can ask your questions at any point. But just thinking about the way community builds, all of you sort of mentioned meeting each other at conventions and some secondary educational sort of opportunities. Do you think with the internet now, are the real life comics conventions still the place where comic community is built?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's 2021, man. There were no conventions last year. There's none on the horizon. For us as a team, in the time since the pandemic began, Matt Bors has moved to Canada. I had to come back to Australia. There was there's some dispersal that happens there. I would love it if by September this year, the vaccines and the border restrictions have eased to the point where we could have an SBX or whatever, but I really don't see that happening in the foreseeable future. So I think that by necessity, the comics community, the hub of that stuff really had to move online. And it's been really interesting seeing how different things have emerged in the last year where you see people connecting. Like I did not play Animal Crossing, but I was surprised by how many people that we work with were like communicating with each other and hanging out in Animal Crossing. And then like, you know, there's people running like life drawing classes online. And like, you know, there's been so many more of these sorts of panels that we've done. I don't think that we'd ever done an online, like a Zoom panel before, you know, this started, but I've done heaps. I actually, aside from doing nib stuff, I also run an Australian comic art workshop. And we had like a all-day seminar online last year that I organized, and that was great. But we did it because we couldn't do it in real life, you know. And like I think that that's going to be a really interesting change in the comic scene. Is like a lot of our connections have been made through real life and meeting people, and honestly, even meeting, coming across a new work. Like Matt and I, and both Matts and I would go to conventions in the earlier days, and like we'd be actively looking at people's work, like at each convention, being like, who's got form doing something nonfiction, even if it's like a memoir, like, you know, what's the quality of work, and like trying to pick people up. And like I would email people after shows and be like, hey, I saw this comic you did about, you know, this thing you did once, and you know, like I'd be interested in, do you reckon that would work for online, or could you make an online version of that? Would you pitch us, you know, that sort of thing? And that's not the case now. And because the nib is independent and we're not running a fire hose of comics out and at the same level as we once were, like it's really changed the curation of, you know, the content that goes online. Like we have to reject so many more people now than we used to in terms of pitches, because there just isn't the budget for it. But also I think that there's a real because in the time, things have changed over time. Like people are much more aware of like nonfiction comics. They've seen a lot of them. They've, you know, they've been exposed. So we actually get more pitches from people just because more people are like, oh, I've seen that done. I could do something like this, you know. But yeah, I hope that there's a lot more outlets there with bigger budgets than ours that can continue to, you know, push stuff out in the next little while. But yeah, sorry, comics conventions. I feel sad about it. Don't you? Doesn't everyone feel sad about it?
Yeah, there's no substitution for like, I mean, I'm thinking that I can think of multiple contributors that we've had that have done multiple things for us, including like magazine features that just like dropped a mini comic on my lap when I was sitting at the nib booth at SPX. Like it was like, there's no substitute for in-person contact, which we've all sort of been in the last 11 months or so. I mean, that said, like, not everyone can get to a convention, so on like some level it's more accessible to people to have these things online. But like, I don't know, I've done lots of, I think like it's sort of for me like the inverse of how real life conventions work, where I'm going to more panels and watching more panels, but doing less of like the browsing 1,500 table, like fake, you know, like online tables or whatever. It's just hard to do. Like, who is the sitting there on your computer and doing that doesn't have the same sort of like buzz as walking around the hall and like looking at work and meeting the person who made it. But yeah, I don't know where I was going with that. It's just
we miss those awkward interactions with readers who come up to your table.
Oh, I don't. Yeah, those are. Yeah, I mean.
No, but there is. It is
work.
It is fun to meet people that read the publication and just, you know, to just drink and talk shop with colleagues, especially because cartooning is such a isolated form. You know, places like SPX and TCAF, I mean, it's like at this point there's like, I mean, I don't even know if it would be an exaggeration to say that 40% of the tablers have at one point worked for us.
I think that there will hopefully that conventions will come back. They might look a little bit different, like less, you know, handshaking and things like that. And even though I really don't know how it can fully work, you know, but yeah, I think I miss like, you know, just browsing and seeing small press stuff. Like it's even looking at, you know, best of lists from last year. There's so much work that you're not going to see because you're not just able to randomly pick it up. Yeah, I don't know. I think that cartoonists too, like most of our time, like is online, and then we're interspersed with shows. So I feel like in a sense we're more adaptable to this compared to other working situations, because we already have this like online infrastructure in some ways that maybe other communities didn't have. But yeah, I really do miss shows, and I don't know if there is a substitute for it fully.
Hey, I mean, you just got an Ignatz in the mail that was just like a brick in a box instead of like, I don't know, do they hand you those in real life? Do they like?
Yeah, usually, and usually like, there's like an award, in-person award ceremony and whatnot, but I'll take what I can get, I guess. It's nice.
Yeah, we all miss the Marriott basement in Maryland. Beautiful place where they give you the bricks.
patio.
Chocolate fountain.
Oh, the fountain.
So many of my best life moments have happened in Bethesda. I never knew that would be the case,
That's just the magic of comics, is to be underpaid and to make you go to Bethesda, Maryland.
I know.
There's going to be a generation of cartoonists who are like currently like 14 or 15 years old who maybe went to SPX once, and that's going to be like their thing. It's going to be like having gone to Woodstock or something. Like, I ate a McDonald's that one time. I met everybody. And I want to talk just for a couple minutes about like kind of the complications of editing comics, particularly where you're dealing with two different kinds of thing to edit. You've got text, you've got image, I guess three things, and then you have the way those things relate. How do you even approach that? What do you sort of dig into first when you get a pitch, and then when you start getting drafts in? And this can be anybody. Sorry.
Larry's good for talking about the long form stuff because she edits most of our features now. But I mean, I think that I can just say something real quick, which is I think a lot of the shorter stuff, well, we're always starting with scripts. I mean, you don't want to be messing around with comics after they're already drawn. As artists, we are aware of that. We're not like, everybody has like clients from hell who just start asking for a ton of revisions after everything's already finished and stuff. So with the comics, especially the political comics, I mean, it's all about the ideas and the script, which is usually, 4 to 6 panels, pretty simple. And me and Matt typically will edit those and get back to people. It's not super heavy editing on that type of stuff. We maybe punch up a joke or change something, but a lot of people, particularly the people who are real regular, have freedom to just kind of do whatever they want. I mean, we'll suggest things sometimes or try to get a comic on a certain issue, but for the most part, it's whatever they're into that week.
Should I talk about long stuff now?
Yeah.
So I think that like definitely scripting, we have a very standardized process at the NIB that we developed pretty early on to try and like make things flow really easily with edits. So we do 2 rounds of script editing, one on thumbnails or rough sketches, pencils, inks, and then colors. But usually at inks and colors, there's almost nothing changed. Like it's like not really where everything is usually being made in those earlier stages. I think that one of the things that is difficult is imagining how someone is going to draw something, or like how that's going to look based on a script. Like that's almost impossible because you can't really get into someone's head in that way. Like even if they draw like write out like a good, like, oh, and on this page we'll have this person doing this thing. It's like you can't like totally see where that's going, but you kind of have to have trust in your artists. Like they've pitched you and you've seen their previous work and you're hiring them because you think they have the capacity to do this. So there's a level of trust that goes into that. But roughs for me are like where I do most of my work on comics. Is like in the script we're usually trying to make things shorter because everyone overwrites, everyone does too many words. And sometimes we need to add stuff like, you need to have like a few expert voices thrown in there, like someone official saying a thing about a thing, because we are using often we're using a traditional journalism, like feature writing style, which works. Like that's, part of the way that we operate. But when it comes to roughs, it's like, okay, well, how is this layout working? And some of it's really basic. Like for me, it's like the text flow, like how where is the reader going? Like, where are their eyes traveling across the page in terms of the action movement, the images, which direction the image is going in. People often don't think about how, because we read in English left to right, that's actually the direction that all of the action should be flowing in, unless you're deliberately trying to make the reader stop and think for a moment. So like, you know, if you've got a car or a bike or anything that's, you need it to be traveling in reading direction, and you need the text to be flowing left to right and down. And because we use dynamic viewing on the nib, so like our comics, you know, we get them in panels, but then when they're on desktop, they'll look like pages mostly. But then when they're on a phone, they're stacked, like on a mobile device. They are like, all the panels are like appearing in a vertical line. So some people just do a comic that is entirely vertical, and the text size has to be like bumped up significantly for that. But like, it's adjustments like that, like thinking about like, what are people getting, what information is being added. Like, we're always trying to push people beyond just illustrating what they've said, you know, like what else could be in there? Like, what other information could be conveyed? Like, you know, we use a lot of infographic stuff with nib things. Like, we actually have a whole section in the magazine and online that's just stats, like cartoon stats, statistics, graphs, you know, like illustrations of data. So it's data, there's data journalism thrown in there, which is a new fancy thing that you can get a real job at a traditional news outlet doing. But it is a thing that we use really regularly. But yeah, it's like trying to get people to think about, like, you're making this as a comic, you're not writing this as a story. You've got to use the medium to the best of its abilities. Like, you should be trying to think about what is being said without being said, if that makes sense. But yeah, and then obviously like inks and pencils, inks and colors, that's just finessing what you already have, and making it look as, you know, nice or polished, or, you know, just conveying the most that you can. Yeah.
Do you ever look and just say, no, that hand really just is, you gotta start from scratch, just like completely start that hand all over again? I speak specifically of the challenge of hands in this case, in drawing hands.
I don't often. It's like, sometimes there's things like, there's some artists, and I'm gonna throw this out. There are some artists who draw like real tiny heads on people, and you're like, this head is too small. Or like when they draw children in particular, like children have huge heads. And so like a really great way to make someone look like an infant is to just give them an enormous head. But sometimes that person is not an infant, they are an adult human. But a lot of that is style, like, because we're talking about a huge variety of styles that the nib publishes, like, you kind of, it's not all realism, you know, and comics journalism isn't like totally wedded in realism. Like our nonfiction comics, like, they have like, you know, we're trying to show things in a way that is not literal, you know, where we've got like more, I'd say more like editorial illustration influences, like, you know, trying to convey an emotion, having oversized people with like different scenarios. I'm working on a comic right now with an artist who is making like doll houses. We're talking about architecture in the post-COVID era. And we're like where the drawings are all like small, tiny houses. And that's a conceit that you can do with comics, and it makes you think about the design and structure of things in a different way. But yeah, I don't usually ask people, I mean, I don't know, like hands that we haven't had, I don't know. Well, there is a very old conflict between Matt Bors and Matt Lubchansky over hands that I will not get involved in, but I will mention.
That's settled. That's
been
old.
settled for 7 years, probably. Settled, buried, and gone.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it.
I meant more like functionally within someone's style, when something violates their own style and is jarring. That's like that, which can happen in a person's art, where it's like, oh yeah, like you are really consistent in all of these things, and then like, did you know that you gave, you know, that person a giant hand, or baby heads? Like, although kids are super weird looking, so I think Emily Flake had like a really great how to draw a toddler like info thing that I actually really personally internalized, like, about how weird looking kids are. Babies like are fine, grown-ups are fine, but like that head growth situation head body relationship is wild. Real life and in comics. I want to talk a little bit about the internet, and we have some questions from people in the YouTube also about the internet. So to start just with Instagram, which has obviously been like kind of weirdly perfect space that is also not perfect for cartoonists. So Heidi asks, has Instagram been a big platform in sort of comics moved to online? And I want to know sort of your own personal relationship with comics and how you've worked on comics.
I mean, I think Instagram is great for comics, particularly when they introduced the slideshow function. We post all of our comics like that. Obviously, not all of them fit the longer stuff, but now you can even swipe up and get people out of the site, since you famously can't put, links in posts. I don't know. That's about it. It's an image-based platform, so it's good for comics. We have a lot of followers on there, but I don't have any real deep thoughts about it, honestly.
I mean, I think problems arise like with any social media thing where like certain art styles or modes of storytelling or whatever will gain popularity. You see a lot of people trying to like ape it to sort of like get like an Instagram aesthetic or whatever. But that's more of a problem with, I think, a lot of like influencer types and less with like comics, which seem mostly, for the most part, on Instagram, just be people posting their work. I mean, there's the obvious problems where like they're owned by Facebook, who we have problems with, and there's sort of like censorious streak when it comes to sexuality or nudity or anything.
Yeah,
so it's like it's good for the promotion of your work. I don't know if it is a good thing for like learning how to be a cartoonist necessarily. I suppose.
Yeah, they take down, people get wild in our comments because we have a lot of posts, and what happens is with anything, with the tweet or whatever, is someone somewhere links to it in a group chat or a message board, and then just people who don't like you, don't even read your stuff, start coming to pile on. And whenever they report something, we'll get a lot of stuff reported from from the right, when especially things that criticize the right, specifically like Proud Boys or MAGA people or whatever.
This leads actually sort of perfectly into a question from Erica, who's watching the YouTube. Can folks who focus on nonfiction, political and /political cartooning talk about what they've seen in regard to satire and sort of how it survives in an age of cancel culture, however you feel about that phrase? And do you think, as artists, as satirists, and as journalists, differently, think about things differently now? Like, and I want to take that a step further, just like the reaction to some of your work online is both your comics and just, like innocuous statements, whatever, is really, really big. And so how do you deal with that when jokes or sort of skewering parts of literally sort of harassing the hornet's nest? Is that what the phrase is? I actually just completely forgot what that was. Stirring up the hornet's nest.
Kicking the
like
hornet's
how do you deal with that?
I don't know. I guess I'll take this. Yeah, I kind of hate talking about cancel culture, just because it's like people are talking about like 6 different things, in my opinion, and everything from whether or not we're holding rapists accountable to if it's okay to criticize a comedian who's making transphobic jokes, and then they say, well, everybody's piling on, to like, obviously just some random person says something sometimes on Twitter, and then it becomes like everyone in the world is talking about some random person's tweet and all that. So all that stuff just gets like, and what I was just talking about, which is, actually being kind of censored by these companies, which is really just a result of their algorithms responding to being like mass reporting. So they're clearly not working. We don't run a lot of stuff. I mean, we don't really run any stuff that I feel is attacking any marginalized groups or anything. So we don't run conservatives. I mean, we're a pretty left leaning publication, and we run stuff that spans kind of liberal to left to even, we have some, like, you know, Ben Passmore is our sort of resident anarchist, and who, you know, is down with like you know, drawing cop cars burning and stuff like that. As far as cancel culture, though, I mean, I don't know. I don't have much to say about it because, like I said, it's just like this big can of worms where everybody's sort of arguing about different things.
Yeah, I think the only thing I guess would be when I'm like, because I run most of the social media, and it's like kind of just don't post something that can be taken very, very, very easily out of context, and that's it. Everything else is sort of like you learn to take when criticism is valid and don't worry about it when it's people clearly acting in bad faith. Like there's been comics we run that we take down or we change or we edit or whatever based on people's legitimate reactions to it, because it is easy to miss the mark when you're making comedy. I think it's important to keep that in mind, but it's also like cancel culture is a thing. I don't know, like political cartoonists have been yelled at in like newspaper letters to the editor for as long as both have existed. You know, we've got a contributor that was fired from their job for being too pro-Palestinian on Twitter. Like, you know, it's not, there's like, that's the real stuff to be worried about. I don't think it's like, yeah, I think that's it.
I think fact checking is also an important thing to mention too, with like the with nonfiction comics, and I think that the nib, that's something that's it's definitely done, and I think that that also kind of strengthens it, and that we're willing to change things. Like I did a COVID comic with Ali Schwed like last year. It was like myths and facts, and like this was before the whole mask. We figured out that, you know, masks help slow transmission, and so we decided to update it. And there was, I remember some comments being like, looking at it, and they were like, oh, like why don't you have that in there? And so we went and we changed it. And so I think that you know, making sure that the information is accurate is super vital to, you know, staying credible.
I spend so much time checking out what people have written. Like it's like hours and hours of my life being like that's what when the scripting stage, that's the big time suck in the scripting stage, is like back checking what people have said and their references and stuff. Yeah.
I think that's an amazing step that a lot of publications, comics or no, don't take. So it's super important. I think it's really, it seems like a really amazing defense against people really coming out. Like, you know, if you feel good about your information. But I think sometimes, you know, how do you react personally when someone like really just runs with something that you've done in a way that's taking it like in the complete opposite direction from your intent? Like I know both Matts have had comics sort of become memes and get out there in the world and sort of just be there. Like how does that feel, and how do you deal with that? Like, do you care? Is it,
if something goes really bad online, I'll just go watch TV or something. Is my you know, take an edible and play some Pokemon. Like I don't know. There's nothing so much of, I've been on like online mine since like the mid 90s, you know, and at some point you just have to realize when things are sort of out of your control, and you say what you say, and you let people interpret it how they're going to interpret it, and you just learn for the future how to say things that'll be misinterpreted less, and just move forward with your life. I don't know if there's anything you can do to like ensure that no one's going to be mad at you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the cartoons that have become memes or whatever, it doesn't bother me in any way. I don't care. I don't know. I was trying to think if I have any thoughts about comics becoming memes that I haven't said before. You know, I think that's a little different from people reacting strongly, though. Like Matt was saying, I mean, I guess at this point I have like fairly thick skin from being online my whole adult life and having people yell at me when they don't like comics that I did. So, but it's, you know, it happens regularly, and sometimes it sucks, and sometimes you don't care at all, and other times it bothers you, and you just do like Matt said, and have an edible and go play Pokemon.
That's my official advice for the students of the University of Pennsylvania, is to get as high as possible.
I won't say how they'll take that, but you know, it seems like a
It can
kit
be a lot
of
of
some
things.
kind.
Mhm.
Just like pop it open and there's your edible and there's your Pokemon cards.
That's correct.
Wait, you guys probably aren't talking about the cards.
I'm talking about the Switch game that I've been playing recently.
I don't know.
I
I
had
was
some
like,
cards as a child.
I never did Pokemon, so I actually don't know what we're talking about. I just said it because Matt said it.
I just
Trying
can't
to be
believe
with
that
the kids outdoors.
we'll all go on to some Animal Crossing island, and I actually don't know how that works. I never downloaded it. It seems kind of expensive, so I didn't. I also have a toddler. She's not going to play it, so we have a couple more minutes. We do have a question about like getting started in cartooning. Julietta asks, is there a virtual tool that you folks recommend for artists who are more used to working on paper? Is Procreate beginner friendly? Truly one of the worst names for an app, but an amazing one. So what are your thoughts about working digitally, and how did you get started or shift to that if you did?
I think Matt Lubchansky should talk about doing the comics digitally, because they're the ones who have who really were doing it earlier on. Matt Bors had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the digital era a few years ago, and me too. So
I love inking on paper, but yeah, I finally made the switch when my first kid was born, and I needed to like produce the comics faster.
Yeah, I got a tablet, like a starter one, I don't know, maybe like 11 or 12 years ago now. And I just sort of like took the time to switch over. And it was worth it for me because I just worked so much faster when I was like trying to pump out like 5 pages of comics a week while working a 60-hour-a-week job. Anyways, I've not used Procreate. I don't have an iPad. I use a Wacom Cintiq tablet. I would say the beginner program for that would be Clip Studio, which I use an old version of called Manga Studio, but it's basically as good as Photoshop, but made just for making comics, and is an order of magnitude cheaper, and you don't have to pay the Adobe Corporation $20 a month for the rest of your life, which is how everything functions now. So I would suggest either. I mean, I know people that swear by Procreate in an iPad Pro, especially if you're doing more painterly stuff. But for my money, you can't beat Clip Studio, which is Clip Studio Paint. Is it what it's called now? I don't keep up with the latest versions.
I feel like for me, making the switch, like I've sort of been going between digital and paper for a long time now. And then last year, I used my Trump money to buy my tablet because I was like, I wanted to try it out. And I found Procreate really easy and intuitive to use. I learned how to use Photoshop when I was in high school. So that's been the program that has been my default for a really long time. And it was a big learning curve in a lot of ways, like learning how to use Procreate, but there are so many excellent tutorials online. This is the thing that is really beneficial to people who are trying to make comics now, as opposed to like when I first started making comics, is it's like, there are videos on how to do everything on YouTube. And there are forums, you can join Facebook groups where people will share tips, like any problem you encounter, I can guarantee you someone else has had that problem and you can find a solution for it. And that's like, that's not just about like using Procreate or Clip Studio or whatever. It's also like drawing. Like you can watch someone do watercolors and give you tips on the internet, and that's fantastic. I think that's a really amazing thing. Whit, what's your feeling on digital? Because you loved pencils.
Yeah, I mean, paper and pen will always be my first love, but like I feel like for something like doing comics for the nib, it's not as efficient, and also having a baby, it's like I don't have time for that right now. I think also needing to make edits, whether it's to text or to art things, it's a lot easier just to be able to do it digitally. So originally I was like drawing stuff using markers, stuff like that, then like scanning it and then like fixing it in Photoshop. And like No. So I recently got a tablet, an iPad last year, and started like teaching myself how to use Procreate, also looking at tutorials and things like that. And I really love it. Like I was one of those late adopters, but like now I'm like all about it, and it's allowed me to try different tools and pens. And that's the other thing, is like you can also get like pens and things like that that don't come with Procreate. So it allows you to kind of, you know, figure out what works best for you, you know, stylistically. But yeah, if it's a lot more efficient, and I think it's pretty user friendly. And this is like coming from someone like me who doesn't really have a like art school background, for instance. Like I was still able to kind of figure it out. So
Awesome. And I think, you know, we're gonna wrap up in just a minute, but I want to know from all of you, like, who, including and beyond, who working in comics just like is really blowing your mind right now? Who do you recommend people go and search out, whether or not it's necessarily directly nonfiction comics or something that the Nib would put out? Just who do you really admire, and who do you think people should look for?
Can I go now?
Look at the recent comics I've read that are, see what's the best one, you know.
I really loved Shannon Wright's Twins. That was really great in terms of like books that were appealing to me last year. If we're talking about people who've done Nib stuff, but I really I'm going to be an Australian here and promote some Australian authors who I think are amazing. Both Pat Grant had a book called The Grot that came out from Top Shelf that's like a climate change dystopia. That's fantastic, and also a con book. So I would really highly recommend that one. And then also Campbell White, another Australian from Perth. He has a series called Home Time, which is about some kids basically getting sucked into a Narnia type scenario. That's really amazing. And the art styles, he uses like 5 different art styles in there, and that's a really beautiful smorgasbord of things. But yeah, none of those are nonfiction books.
Matt mentioned him before, and I think because I read his latest recently, but Ben Passmore for sure does a lot of really amazing work that I love right now. His art is so good, and I just vibe with what he has to say in his work. And yeah, I think he's great, and everything he puts out has been great. And he's, I don't know, yeah, including his new work, but I really love his like long form, the books that he's been doing.
Yay, Matt.
Thinking about like, you know, my interest in health education, I think about Isabella Rotman as someone who does a lot of good stuff. She has recently put out a book on like health sex ed for teens or something like that, and she does a lot of good like zines and minis and stuff like that. And another person is Bianca Eunice. She just has really great commentary on being a Black woman, being a millennial, being a person who deals with depression, for instance. Just like very like sharp and quick-witted and thoughtful.
I love Bianca's work.
I'm trying to think who to say. I was gonna say like, I don't know. I really thought Durf's latest book on Kent State was you know, one of the best nonfiction books that's come out in a while. Also, Sarah Merck, who edits with us, did a book on Guantanamo Bay that is great. And I read a ton of comics that are not nonfiction and love that stuff. But I guess I'll just plug some stuff that's in the works that's coming out, because I was looking at like the books that we plan to sell on our store over like this year, and there's a lot of big nonfiction releases coming out. Like WHIT has one coming on Harriet Tubman. I know Chelsea Saunders, who has done work with us, is working on her like debut graphic novel. I don't think it's not coming out this year. She has a long way to go still, but there's just like a lot of exciting work that's being done in this field. Matt has a great book coming out in a month or two called the Antifa Super Soldier Cookbook or whatever. You have one, Matt?
It's literally on my desk. Right here.
Great.
Look at that. Silver Sprocket, March 2021. And the nib, yeah. It will be on the store.
Yeah, and so you can find a lot of those books if you're watching on YouTube at the Nibs store. I think it's just, what's the address? Nib.
Well, the
store?
nib. You just go to the nib.com. Everything's pretty easy to find, whether it's the store or, you know, membership / magazine subscription.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank all of you so much for sharing your time and your thoughts on comics, and being here in this virtual space. I know that your work is pretty accessible online, and if you are watching this YouTube and you don't follow the Nib or any of these people on their various social media channels, I would strongly recommend doing so. It is a shame how much free amazing cartooning is out there, which is also a reason to subscribe to the Nib to help balance those things out. And I don't know if you can all hear this, but my child is coming up the stairs getting ready for bath time.
Great.
You know, schedules stop for no one. So thank you all again for this, and thank you everyone for watching.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you for having
Thanks so much
us.
for having us.
Thanks, Alan.
Yeah.
Bath time.
Yeah.